Had a grocery list. That was all I was thinking about. Milk, coffee filters, the good kind of bread my doctor keeps telling me to switch to. Whole grain. I keep buying it and keep hating it. But I buy it anyway because at 63 years old, I've run out of reasons to argue with sensible advice. It was a Tuesday. I remember that specifically because I always go on Tuesdays. Fewer people. The parking lot at the Kroger off Route 9 is half empty on a Tuesday morning, and I can get in and out without running into anyone who wants to have a long conversation about how I'm holding up. People mean well, I know that. But how are you holding up gets heavy after a while. You can only answer it so many ways before the words stop meaning anything. My wife had been gone for 7 months. Her name was Lorraine. We were married for 31 years. She died in March, a blood clot. Sudden. The kind of thing that doesn't give you any warning and doesn't ask your permission. One morning she was sitting at the kitchen table with her reading glasses on, doing the crossword the way she did every single day. And then she wasn't. The paramedics said she probably didn't feel much. I've been holding on to that like a lifeline ever since, so there I was. 7 months later. Tuesday morning. Grocery list in my hand, cart in front of me, standing in the cereal aisle trying to remember if we were out of oatmeal. I say we still. I catch myself doing it all the time. Old habit. That's when I saw her. She was at the far end of the aisle near the display of granola bars, reaching up to the top shelf. She had darker hair than Lorraine's. Lorraine had gone silver years ago and wore it with a kind of quiet pride. But the way this woman moved stopped me completely. The way she tilted her head to the left when she was reaching for something. The slight hesitation before she grabbed what she wanted, like she was second-guessing herself. Lorraine did that. Lorraine always did that. I told myself it wasn't her. Obviously it wasn't her. I had stood at a graveside in the rain in March and watched them lower a casket into the ground. I had held my daughter's hand. I had thanked people for coming. I had driven home alone and sat in my car in the driveway for 20 minutes because I couldn't make myself go inside. I told myself to move on, grab my oatmeal, go home. But then she turned slightly, reaching for something on a lower shelf, and I saw the back of her left hand. Lorraine had a scar there, a thin white line, maybe 2 inches long, running diagonally across the knuckles. She got it in 1998 when our son knocked a glass off the counter and she caught it the wrong way. 12 stitches. We still joked about it. She called it her war wound. This woman had the same scar. Same hand. Same diagonal line. I stood there holding a box of oatmeal I didn't remember picking up. She turned further and I got a partial look at her face. My heart was doing something it probably shouldn't have been doing at 63. It wasn't Lorraine. It couldn't be Lorraine. But something in my chest had completely stopped listening to reason. She moved toward the end of the aisle. I followed. Not close. I stayed back far enough that she wouldn't notice me. Close enough that I wouldn't lose her. I felt like a fool and I didn't stop. She picked up a few more items, moving through the store with a kind of purpose, not browsing. She knew what she wanted. At the checkout, she paid with a card, said something brief and polite to the cashier, smiled once. That smile. I put my cart to the side and watched. My oatmeal was still in my hand. She walked out through the sliding doors. I left the cart right there in the middle of the checkout lane and followed her into the parking lot. I know how that sounds. I'm not trying to make myself look good here. I'm telling you what happened. She got into a dark green Honda CR-V. I watched her pull out of the space, and before I even made a conscious decision, I had my phone out and I typed the license plate number into my notes. I drove home with nothing. No groceries. No answers. Just a license plate number and a feeling I didn't know what to do with. I didn't sleep that night. I told myself all the rational things. Grief does things to you. The brain looks for familiar patterns. I had read about this somewhere, how people who lose someone they love will sometimes see them in strangers for years afterward. The tilt of a head, a particular laugh, something about the way a person stands. If the mind's still searching, still refusing to fully let go, that was all this was. But the scar. I kept coming back to the scar. Because that wasn't a posture or a mannerism that could be replicated by coincidence. That was a specific, physical mark in a specific location on a specific hand that matched exactly what I had seen 1,000 times across 31 years of marriage. By Wednesday morning, I had made a decision I was probably going to regret. I called a man named Pete Grover. Pete had been with the county sheriff's department for 22 years before he retired and opened a small private investigation firm out of an office above a dry cleaner on Elm. He was a friend of a friend, had done some work for a guy I knew in my Rotary Club, and came with a recommendation that he was discreet. Discreet was what I needed. I told Pete I needed him to run a plate and find out who owned a dark green Honda CR-V. I gave him the number. He asked me why. The way people who are good at their jobs always ask the questions that are hardest to answer. I told him I thought I had seen someone I recognized and I needed to confirm it. He took the job. He didn't push. He called me back Thursday afternoon. The vehicle was registered to a woman named Judith Calloway. The address was on Birchwood Lane, about 4 miles from the Kroger. I wrote everything down with my hand not quite steady. That name meant nothing to me. Judith Calloway. I turned it over. Nothing. I asked Pete to find out more. I went back to the Kroger on Friday. Not because I had any reason to think she'd be there. Just because I didn't know where else to start. And I needed to do something with the feeling that had taken up permanent residence in my chest. I walked every aisle. I bought the groceries I had abandoned on Tuesday. She wasn't there. Pete called again on Saturday. Judith Calloway had moved to Birchwood Lane approximately 6 months ago. Before that, there was very limited history. A gap, Pete said. Like someone who had started over. No prior address in the county. No employment records locally beyond the last 6 months. She had a part-time position at a medical billing office on the other side of town, had opened a bank account at a regional branch in September. There was, Pete told me carefully, something odd about the documentation trail. Social Security records that felt recent in a way that didn't quite line up with a woman who appeared to be in her late 50s or early 60s. I sat with that for a long time. I asked Pete one more thing. I asked him if Judith Calloway attended any church in the area. He came back to me on Monday. She did. She had been attending a Methodist congregation on Cedar Street for the past 4 months. Services on Sunday mornings. I want to be honest about what I was feeling by this point. It wasn't hope. Hope would have been something almost pleasant. What I was feeling was something darker and colder, something that sat in my stomach like a stone, because the possibility I was beginning to allow myself to consider was not a good one. It was not the kind of thing that had a happy ending attached to it. I went to that Methodist church the following Sunday. I sat in the back row. I hadn't been to a church service since Lorraine's funeral, and the familiar sounds of it, the organ, the low murmur of people settling into pews, the smell of old wood and candle wax hit me harder than I expected. I kept my head down until the service started. She came in with a man. He was younger than her by what looked like 15 years. Well-dressed, easy manner, the kind of man who shakes hands with everyone and remembers names. He held the door for her. He touched the small of her back as they walked to their seats. They sat 4 rows ahead of me and 1 section to the left. For the entire service, I watched the back of her head. The way she sat. The way she reached up once to push her hair back from her face. The hair was darker, like I said, and shorter than Lorraine had worn it, but the gesture was Lorraine's. The exact gesture, the angle of the elbow, the slight tilt of the chin. And then, when the congregation stood for a hymn and she half turned to share a hymnal with the woman beside her, I saw her face clearly for the first time. I had to grip the back of the pew in front of me. It was Lorraine. Not someone who looked like Lorraine. Not a woman with a similar bone structure or a passing resemblance. It was my wife. Thinner in the face, different hair, but my wife. The small indentation at the corner of her left eye. The one she had from a childhood fall that she'd told me about on our 3rd date. The particular way her lower lip sat. Everything. I left before the service ended. I walked to my car and I sat there for a long time without starting the engine. I'm going to tell you that I cried. I'm 63 years old and I'm past the point of being embarrassed about that. I cried because I didn't know what I was grieving anymore. I had already grieved her. I had done that. I had lived through the worst months of my life believing my wife was dead. And I had come out the other side, slowly, painfully, and now I didn't know what any of it had meant. When I was calmer, I started to think. If Lorraine was alive, and she was, I knew that now the same way I know anything that I know in my bones, Then someone had died in her place. Someone had been buried in that cemetery in March. Someone I had stood beside a casket for. I called Pete again that afternoon. Pete is a methodical man. He told me to slow down and tell him everything from the beginning. I did. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "You need to understand that what you're describing, if it's accurate, is not just a personal matter. This is criminal." I told him I understood. He said he would need a few days. Those days were the longest of my life, longer even than the days right after the funeral, because at least then I had known what I was suffering over. Now I was in a state that didn't have a name. My wife was alive. My wife had chosen to be dead. Those two things couldn't both be true, and yet they were. I went back to the house and I started looking at things I had not let myself look at in 7 months. Our finances. Specifically, our joint accounts and the business account for the small property management company I had been running for the past 18 years. I had not looked closely at any of it since March. My accountant had handled everything. I had signed what I was told to sign, and I had not had the energy or the will to dig deeper. I wish I had looked sooner. Over a period of 4 years, going back to 2022, money had been leaving our accounts in a pattern that I had not noticed because it had been designed not to be noticed. Not large amounts at once. Transfers in the range of $8,000 to $12,000, sometimes less, spread across different months. Some of them categorized as operating expenses for the business, some of them moving to an account I didn't recognize. The total, when I finally sat down with a calculator and went through every statement, was somewhere in the range of $1.4 million. $1.4 million. Gone. Over 4 years. From accounts my wife had full access to. I put the calculator down on the kitchen table, and I looked out the window at the backyard where Lorraine had planted the rose bushes that were now going wild because I hadn't known how to care for them. And I felt something shift inside me that I don't entirely have words for. Pete called me at the end of the week. He had done his work carefully. What he found was this. The woman buried in Lorraine's place was a Jane Doe who had died in a hospital in Columbus, Ohio, roughly 2 weeks before Lorraine's supposed death, unidentified. No family who came forward, similar age and build. The death certificate for Lorraine, Pete had discovered through some careful digging that I don't need to get into, had documentation anomalies. The identification of the body had relied almost entirely on dental records, records that, it turned out, had been submitted by a dentist's office that had closed the previous year, and whose files had apparently been transferred in a way that left them vulnerable to alteration. Someone had planned this, not in a panic, not spontaneously. This had been planned over years. Pete told me there was something else. My daughter knew, not suspected, knew. Pete had found communications, the kind of digital trail that people think disappears and doesn't, between my daughter and a cell number that traced back to a prepaid phone purchased in the same town where Lorraine was now living. The messages went back 8 months. They had been talking all along. My daughter, who had held my hand at the funeral, who had cried in my arms, who had called me every Sunday since March to check in, to ask how I was eating, to tell me she loved me. I don't know how to describe what that felt like. I've tried. I can't do it without either going too far or not going far enough. It was its own kind of burial. I called an attorney that same evening, a friend from years back who handled civil and criminal matters, someone I trusted completely. I told him everything. He listened without interrupting, and when I finished he said, "Don't contact either of them. Don't signal anything. Come see me in the morning." I didn't sleep that night either. What followed over the next several weeks is the part I'll tell you without every detail, because some of it is still working through the courts, and my attorney has advised me accordingly. But I'll tell you the shape of it. With Pete's documentation and my financial records, my attorney worked with the district attorney's office. A forensic accountant was brought in who confirmed what I had found and then found more. The total, once everything was properly traced, came out to $1.6 million. There was a life insurance policy, $250,000, that had been filed for and paid out after Lorraine's death that had already been moved into an account under the name Judith Calloway. The man she was with, the well-dressed man from the church, turned out to have known her for at least 3 years. Whether he was aware of everything she had done is a question for the courts. What is documented is that the house on Birchwood Lane had been purchased in his name 14 months ago before Lorraine had officially died. This had not been a spontaneous escape. This had been an exit, built piece by piece, while I was living in the same house, eating dinner across the table from her, trusting her with everything. My daughter was contacted by investigators. She initially denied knowledge of her mother's whereabouts. That lasted approximately 40 minutes before her attorney advised her that the evidence made denial not just implausible, but actively harmful to her own situation. She made a statement. Lorraine was located at the house on Birchwood Lane on a Thursday morning in October. I was not there. I had asked not to be there. My attorney called me when it was over. She was taken into custody. The charges included identity fraud, financial fraud, wire fraud, insurance fraud, and conspiracy. The insurance fraud charge alone carries a significant federal dimension, given how the life insurance payout was handled. My daughter received her own set of charges, reduced by her cooperation. Probation, a substantial fine. The kind of outcome that does not feel like justice, but is, technically, the law doing what it does. I have not spoken to either of them. My attorney advises me not to, and I agree with that advice, but I want you to understand that my agreeing with it is not the same as finding it easy. My daughter and I spoke every Sunday. My daughter called me dad, and she meant it, or I believed she meant it. I don't know anymore what was real. What I know is this. The rose bushes in the backyard are still going wild. I haven't had the heart to cut them back, and I haven't had the knowledge to care for them properly, and I'd been watching them from the kitchen window for 7 months, wondering what to do with them. Last week, my neighbor, a retired woman named Bev, who brings me tomatoes from her garden every August, came by and asked if she could help me with the garden. She knows a bit about roses. I said yes. It was not a large thing. It was one of the smallest things. But I stood at the back door and watched her work, and something in me, not healed, not fixed, nothing like that. Something in me settled just slightly. I gave away nothing for free. I grieved the marriage I thought I had. I grieved the daughter I thought I knew. I grieved 31 years of a life I built with someone who was, apparently, building a separate exit the entire time. That grief is real, and it is mine, and it doesn't disappear because Lorraine turned out to be a criminal instead of a corpse. But I'm still here. I get up in the morning. I make the whole grain bread I still don't love. I go to the Kroger on Tuesdays when the parking lot is half empty. I keep the list in my hand. I don't know what I would have done if I hadn't looked up at that moment in the cereal aisle. If I had been facing the other direction, if she had moved faster, if the scar had been on the other hand where I wouldn't have seen it. But I did look up, and I did see it, and whatever comes next, the trial, the lawyers, the long process of untangling 31 years of shared finances from 31 years of fraud, whatever comes next, I know what is true. I know who I am. I know what I did and did not deserve. I made it through the worst morning of my life twice. Once in March, and once in that cereal aisle on a Tuesday. I'm still standing. And I intend to keep it that way. If you've been through something like this, the betrayal that comes not from an enemy but from the person you trusted most, I want you to know that you're not alone. The hardest part isn't the money. It isn't even the legal process. The hardest part is rebuilding your own sense of what was real. It takes time. It takes longer than you think it should. But you keep going. You make the list. You go to the store, and you keep your eyes open. I've thought a lot about cause and effect since all of this happened, not in any grand philosophical way, just the plain practical version of it. The idea that every choice a person makes sends something out into the world, and eventually that something finds its way back. Lorraine made choices. She made them quietly, over years, in the space between what I could see and what I trusted. She moved money in increments small enough not to trigger alarm. She built a parallel life while sitting across from me at breakfast. She planned an exit with the same hands that planted rose bushes in our backyard. And she involved our daughter. That last part. I keep coming back to that. Not as the worst thing necessarily, but as the most instructive. Because whatever Lorraine built over those 4 years required someone else to help hold it up. It required Beverly to look at her father at a graveside and say nothing. That's not a small ask. That's asking someone to trade their own integrity for yours. And neither of them could outrun it. Lorraine stayed 4 miles from the Kroger she used to shop at. She went back to a church in the same county. She kept habits that were hers and didn't think about who might recognize them. A scar on the back of a hand. The way she tilted her head. The way she reached for something on a shelf. You can change your name. You can dye your hair. You cannot change the way you've moved through the world for 60 years. That's the thing she didn't account for. What I've had to reckon with on my side is harder in some ways. Because I was not without fault in the ordinary sense. Not the fraud, not the deception, that was entirely hers. But I had stopped paying attention, not to her, to the numbers, to the accounts. I trusted because I had always trusted. And I confused trust with wisdom. They're not the same thing. Trust is a feeling. Wisdom is the discipline to verify what you feel. I had one and not the other for a long time. The intelligence I've tried to apply since is quieter than I expected. It doesn't look like suspicion. It looks like attention. Paying attention to what's in front of you. Looking up in the cereal aisle instead of down at your list. Noticing the things that don't quite fit. That's not paranoia. That's just being present in your own life. The resilience part. The part about staying standing. I didn't manufacture that. It was already there. Every person who has made it through something they didn't think they could survive finds out afterward that they already had what they needed. They just didn't know it yet because they'd never needed to use it. I needed to use it. I used it. I needed to use it. I used it. Lorraine made choices that hollowed out 31 years of what I thought we were. Beverly made a choice that I'm still grieving. But I made a choice too, that Tuesday in the parking lot. I wrote down the plate number. I made the call. I sat with the accountant. I went to the attorney. I didn't look away from any of it, even when looking at it was the hardest thing I'd ever done. That's what I'd want anyone to take from this. Not the drama of it. Not the fraud charges or the federal case or the insurance money. The plain, unglamorous truth underneath all of it. The people who wronged you are responsible for what they did. You are responsible for what you do next. Those are 2 separate ledgers. Keep yours clean. Keep your eyes open. And go to the store on Tuesdays when it's quiet. Pay attention to who's there.